Hello and welcome to the sixth of our StJohnsPipeCasts. Having recently done a talk on Disraelian conservatism, it's only natural perhaps that one of my students suggested that I follow it up with a talk about Gladstonian liberalism. And given that so much of the politics of both these men was formed by their reciprocal rivalry and conflict over several decades, it was indeed an eminently sensible suggestion. So today I hope to redeem that pledge and complement my outline of Disraelian conservatism with a comparable exposition of Gladstonian liberalism. I must begin by emphasising that Gladstonian liberalism was not the same thing as Victorian liberalism. Although Gladstone was probably the greatest of all Victorians, and perhaps too Victorian England's most famous liberal, Gladstonian liberalism was not the same thing as Victorian liberalism, a fact that was to prove a source of some quite few difficulties for the Liberal Party that Gladstone led, and led of course for 25 years. He was Liberal leader, but during this whole period in which he led the Liberal Party, he was never exactly precisely himself a Liberal. Yes, there were key similarities, such as attachment to a minimal state and the importance of individual liberty. Reflecting back upon a long political career in 1891, a career which had seen Gladstone begin as what Macaulay dubbed the rising hope of those stern, unbending Tories, and end indeed as leader of the Liberal Party itself, Gladstone remarked as follows: "For myself, I think I can truly put up all the change that has come into my politics into a sentence. I was brought up to distrust and dislike liberty. I learned to believe in it. That is the key to all my changes." Now, no liberal, I think, would wish to demur from that position. But there were profound differences too. And even when Gladstone and conventional liberals shared similar principles or ideals, the logic behind those principles was often subtly different. Three elements in Gladstone's personal history provided a distinctive context to his later liberalism. First was the fact that Gladstone began his political career as an avowed conservative and identified with the high Tory cause. Much of this youthful Toryism was later discarded, but not all. For example, Gladstone retained a concept of the nation as an organic, interconnected community, a collectivity with an identity and meaning simply beyond simply the heaping up of the individual members of it. This viewpoint can be traced back to his Oxford reading of Aristotle and Coleridge, and was never abandoned by Gladstone. A more recent Victorian liberal, Margaret Thatcher, once said that there is no such thing as society, only individuals. Well, Gladstone would have disagreed with that. Second was the powerful influence exerted upon Gladstone in the 1840s by the personality of Sir Robert Peel. It was through contact with Peel that Gladstone evolved from high Tory to Liberal Conservative, and Peel's brand of executive efficiency remained an abiding feature of his approach to government. According to Peelite doctrine, a political leader, appraised of the facts, had a duty to make policy in the interests of the nation, and it was the duty of lesser politicians to fall into line and deliver that correctly ascertained policy. This reasoning had an obvious tendency to lead to what Richard Shannon has called executive arrogance, and this indeed proved a recurring characteristic of Gladstone's politics. Most disastrously for the Liberals in 1885, when Gladstone became convinced of the need to grant Home Rule for Ireland, an epoch-making policy shift, and yet one which he felt no need to consult his own Liberal Party in connection with. The Liberal Party broke up under this Peel-like conviction, just as Peel had broken up the Conservatives in 1845, owing to his conviction that the Corn Laws needed to be scrapped immediately. Third and most important was the religious dimension to Gladstone's political heritage. Brought up a strong evangelical, Gladstone always considered himself in politics to do God's work. One aspect of this was Gladstone's commitment to Anglicanism as the true embodiment of the Catholic tradition within England. Gladstone entered politics in the 1830s to uphold the established status of the established Church of England. And while he came to advocate religious toleration, he was never a nonconformist and attached considerable importance to upholding the teaching and organisation of the Church of England, as exemplified, for example, in his hostility to the non-denominational Bible-based teaching included in Forster's 1870 Education Act. An Education Act, remember, that was overseen and implemented by Gladstone's very own government. But beyond the forms of religious worship in England, Gladstone approached all politics from a Christian ethical viewpoint. The ultimate test of all policy for Gladstone was whether it made Britain a better nation of Christians. The progress Gladstone most wished to see was not material. It was the progress of the nation in Christian morality. The ultimate test of any policy was would it promote the free pursuit of Christian conduct. So for these reasons, Gladstonian Liberalism was a unique set of political ideas, defined and constituted by someone who had no parallel in politics then or since. A high Tory Anglican who became a Peelite and then a liberal, and indeed even a radical, but who throughout these new ideological guises never properly discarded or rejected the experiences and education that shaped him. Hence, Gladstonian liberalism was Gladstone's liberalism and nobody else's. Let us now look at some of the leading constituents of Gladstonian liberalism. Well, first, and the most essential element, was the promotion of individual freedom of choice as an ethical good. The idea that individuals should be free to choose their own course of conduct was a mainstream liberal doctrine, usually justified, of course, by the argument that each person knew their own best interests, and therefore should be free to promote those and pursue them as they felt they wished to. Gladstone would have disagreed with this, but it was not the chief element making for his devotion to individual freedom. Gladstone went further back, rather, to the concept of the Christian free will. God had given humans freedom of will so they could prove themselves virtuous by their actions. Only actions freely chosen could be morally good or bad. Every individual had the right to be free and thereby prove their worth through their actions and become thereby a truly adult member of a civic society. Life was a test of character, and only when there was freedom could good characters prove themselves and be rewarded, and bad characters show themselves and be punished. To quote Gladstone himself, "The best thing the government can do for the people is to remove the obstacles which are in the way of their so helping themselves. I have no faith in any system of government which strikes at the root of human freedom. And if any government pretends that it teaches men how to live, that it will undertake the finding for them of what as citizens and fathers of families they ought to find for themselves, the government, be its intention good or bad, is not conferring a benefit, but inflicting an injury on that people." Hence, the first responsibility of government was to allow men and women greater scope for free action, by taxing as little as possible so they could choose how to spend their money, by allowing them the chance to rise through society by their own exertions, by allowing them the freedom to worship as they wished, or not to worship as they pleased, the freedom to visit a pub and drink alcohol if that was their pleasure, and so on. Government should be as small and interfere as little as possible, the absolute opposite of our modern welfare paternalist state. The second element of Gladstone's liberalism was a commitment to laissez-faire economic policy. Now, free trade was another application of Gladstone's ethical freedom principle. Government should be as small as possible and interfere in the economy as little as possible. Government intervention was always damaging the functioning of the free market economy. Remember, Gladstone had been president of the Board of Trade under Peel and had helped Peel implement his free trade policies through, for example, reducing tariffs and promoting commerce. Gladstone accepted the mainstream teaching of the then conventional political economy, and he believed that government intervention generally hindered the functioning of the capitalist market system and therefore should be avoided. But again, this was not Gladstone's chief motivation for believing in a minimal state. His main point was that a large state required a large taxation, and this was conducive to corruption in the state and a diminished ability of individual citizens to make moral choices through how they decided to spend their own money. So, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1860s, Gladstone bore down on government spending and taxation. His ultimate goal, of course, was to abolish income tax, which he described as a terrible engine of finance, and replace it with raising of government funds for a small number of indirect taxes on items of mass consumption. By this means, the state would be locked into a minimalist condition. For any government wishing to spend more on foreign wars or grandiose projects would have to tax the great body of the nation and could therefore expect to be voted out of office at the next election. So, the state should remain small, with individuals retaining control of the bulk of their income. And to ensure that it remains small, the tax base ought to be as limited as possible. The third element of Gladstone's Liberalism was a belief in the superior moral virtue of the masses. Although he had been fired to enter politics in 1832 by opposition to the Whig Reform Act, Gladstone in the course of his career became a Democrat, favouring the extension of the right to vote to most of the adult male population. Such a belief in democracy was again a general, though not universal, aspect of Victorian liberalism. Gladstone himself proposed a reform bill in 1866, and in 1884 he himself extended the right to vote to the greater part of the rural male working population. But once again, Gladstone's motivation was distinctive. As the British economy prospered in the mid-Victorian boom years, Gladstone became increasingly alarmed at what he considered the corrupting effects of wealth and luxury upon the rising business and financial class, what he called the plutocracy. These plutocrats of new money were, Gladstone believed, unprincipled and selfish, unlike the best of the old landed elites. Worse still, they were increasingly mixing with the old landed class, corrupting them as well. The cult of imperialist expansion and the excesses of Disraeli's jingoism were all traced by Gladstone to the corrupting effects of the new plutocracy. What force could resist the rise of money selfishness that was threatening the very character of England? The answer, according to Gladstone, was the mass of the working and lower middle classes. The masses had little money and were not therefore prone to corruption. They retained a simple faith in God and lived by a simple Christian ethic. The poor were virtuous in a way that the rich were not. And so by extending the right to vote to the poor, the excesses of the social elites could be checked. As Gladstone once explained, on one side commonly stand the public. On the other side in this country stands what are called the classes. The public very seldom thinks seriously about its own interests. Classes always do. All the world over, I will back the masses against the classes. Put simply, the voice of the people was the voice closest to God's, and democracy was therefore a moral Christian good. But to this Gladstone added a further dimension. Yes, the people were good, and they voted rightly. However, they were too many in number and too ill-educated to actually run the country. For this they required a man who was also good, a leader who was uncorrupted by power and guided by Christian principles. Yes, you guessed it, they needed Gladstone, the people's William, who would harness the virtue of the masses and direct it to Christian ends. The final element in Gladstone's liberalism was a belief in national self-determination. One continuity in Gladstone's career, tracing back to his days as a young Tory, was a conviction that nations were real and significant entities, and that peoples organised in nations had the right to govern themselves, free from coercion by other peoples. Now, nationalism in the mid-19th century was a progressive ideology espoused by radicals like Mazzini and enemies of empires. And Gladstone shared in this radical vision of nationalism. He supported, for example, the struggles of the Italians to free themselves from Austro-Hungarian rule, and he came to believe that Ireland was a nation, and as such deserved its own government. He opposed the ideology of imperialism, and remarkably for the time, he sympathised with those people struggling to resist colonial rule. Egypt for the Egyptians, Sudan for the Sudanese, were both causes he espoused. And when Disraeli's foreign policy led him to invade Afghanistan, Gladstone warned during his 1879 Midlothian campaign, "Remember the rights of the savage, as we call him. Remember that the happiness of his humble home, remember that the sanctity of life in the hill villages of Afghanistan among the wintry snows is as inviolable in the eye of Almighty God as can be your own." Gladstone considered empire as a pernicious entity, full stop. The empire trampled on the rights of the colonised, corrupted British politics at the behest of plutocrats like Cecil Rhodes, and imposed burdens of defence administration that would eventually undermine British power. What Gladstone wanted to see was independent nations governing themselves and forming peaceful relations with other nations to uphold international law, settling disputes through arbitration, a policy that was then referred to as the Concert of Europe. As such, Gladstone was the fountainhead of Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points, with its call for national self-determination and the establishment of the League of Nations. Wilson was a disciple of Gladstone's, and in Paris in 1919, Gladstone's ideals helped to remake Europe and the world. Let us then conclude. These then are the leading elements of Gladstonian liberalism as an ideology. It is not to say, of course, that Gladstone always acted upon them in practice. To take one glaring inconsistency, after having denounced Disraeli's imperial adventures and declaring Egypt for the Egyptians, Gladstone actually, in 1882, oversaw a British invasion of Egypt, which overthrew its nationalist leader and made Egypt, in effect, part of the empire, Egypt for the British, something Disraeli himself would never have dared to do. Gladstone was, after all, a politician, and as hypocritical as any other politician, maybe indeed more so. Even so, Gladstone's liberalism stands out, I think, as a rigorous and powerful set of principles, and ones which, I think, can still be applied to contemporary politics with some benefit. They certainly represent a powerful riposte to the current tendency of governments to regulate our lives in ever greater detail. For as Gladstone once said, in words I think of some wisdom, there is no better way to fit a man for liberty than to give it to him. Thank you.